welcome all of you to this Common Awards webinar. Really glad that you're able to join us, and I hope you enjoy the session today. Just a couple of things before I hand over to our presenters. I'm Mike Higton. I'm part of the academic leadership for Common Awards from the Durham University side. I should say that we are recording this session, and we will eventually put the video up. It will just be the sort of presentation bits, not the Q&A bits that we end up putting up. That'll be probably in a few weeks' time. But just be aware that recording is going, and that's the purpose of that recording. Also, while the presenting is going on, if you could turn your videos off, it just helps with the video production and the way that Teams does that. You can turn them back on when we get to the Q&A session, but that'd be really helpful if you're not one of the presenters. So I don't think there are any other practicalities from me. I'm going to hand over to our presenters in just a moment, but let me tell you a bit about who they are before I hand over. So you're going to be hearing from Sharon Jagger, who's Associate Professor in Religion at the School of Humanities, York St John University, author most recently of Women Priests, Symbolic Violence and Symbolic Resistance, which came out last year with Routledge. You've got Alex Fry, who's Senior Lecturer in Social Sciences in the School of Law and Society at Bournemouth Uni, amongst other things, author of Gender Inequality in the Ordained Ministry of the Church of England, also from Routledge fairly recently. You've got Rachel Simons, who's the Academic Registrar at the Eastern Region Ministry course, having previously worked for the employment tribunals as part of the judicial training team, as I understand it. And also you've got someone who was involved in the writing of the report, Becky Tyndall, who's a PhD student in the Department of Theology and Religion here in Durham, working on the experience of working class women clergy in the C of E, and author of a paper on what we talk about when we talk about class, discourse about the working class in the Church of England General Synod, which came out fairly recently with Practical Theology. So I'm going to shut up at this point and hand over to our presenters, who are going to be leading us through the content. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Mike. It's brilliant to be here. Alex, shall I share? I've got the PowerPoint up, so if I'll share. Excellent, thank you very much. So if many of you will actually know that Alex and I and Becky worked on this piece of research that was commissioned by the Church of England, and this is the cover of the report that we produced. It's exploring the working class, the well-being of working class clergy in the Church of England. I'm very happy to put a link in the chat at the end if you've not seen that. So some of what we're talking about today started with this commissioned piece of work, and Alex is going to give you more background to that in a minute. So and just like to really say a massive thank you to Becky, who absolutely carried us many a time. So absolutely was amazing in this project, and also just to acknowledge that she did an awful lot of work on the extra briefing note that we've supplied everybody with. So absolutely thank you to you, Becky, and do jump in if you've got thoughts and want to say something. So I'm going to hand over to Alex, who'll just take us through the context for what we're talking about. Great, and I'll pop the slides over.
Perfect, thank you. So just to set the scene, why we did this project in the first place, and actually it was something that was commissioned by Living Ministry. And historically, we know that there is an association with the Church of England as the established church with elitism and with what we ended up calling kind of upper middle class culture. One example of a publication that talks about this, you might well be familiar with Andrew Brown and Linda Woodhead's book, That Was the Church That Was. It sets the scene in that sort of way. And it talks about how clergy, I think it was during the 1970s in particular, were recruited via Oxbridge and the public school system. And then there's a special issue of sociological research online, which is dedicated to Christianity in class, that was edited by Sarah Jane Page, Matthew Guest, and others, which explored this in a bit more detail a few years ago. I think that was back in 2017. And as well, there's quite a useful text called Religion and Change in Modern Britain. And Matthew Guest and a few others have a chapter in that text as well, which outlines the privileged status that the Church of England has historically had within our society and the class dimension of that. But nevertheless, class has been ignored in a lot of social research, as well as in a lot of political discourses for a number of decades. And that's in the face of growing socioeconomic inequality and diminished well-being. And this trajectory really started before the austerity policies that were implemented in 2010. But 2010, that change of government, the introduction of austerity, was a significant catalyst for that growing inequality as well. And yet, weren't really talking very much about class. They might use euphemisms such as working people or perhaps hard-working people, but there was no joint-up discourse around class and class differences. The Church of England has realised that there is an underrepresentation of working class leaders within the Church of England, within any sort of part of its ordained hierarchy, but also in particular those in more senior roles. And this context really emerged around the same time as well-being started to become a bigger theme for the church, not just the Church of England, but in different denominations and church traditions as well. And so we see living ministry as, I think it's a 10-year longitudinal research, mixed methods piece of research, which is coming to an end this year, I believe. And as part of living ministry, there was a greater recognition of intersectionality and the consequent lived experience. So what I mean by that is people having multiple characteristics or identities and how those converge to shape particular experiences of human flourishing, or perhaps inhibited flourishing within the Church of England. So, for example, you know, if you look at the intersection of someone's priestly vocation and their class background, well, if you're from a working class background, you're going to have a very different experience of ministry and therefore well-being than someone who has a priestly vocation but perhaps a middle class background. And that's not just been true of class. Selina Stone did a satellite project for living ministry on global majority heritage clergy, noting how that intersection of being a priest who has global majority heritage leads to certain experiences and therefore certain experiences of well-being. So there's been greater recognition of that, partly as the result of living ministry findings. But you also have the clergy covenant, where the Church of England formally recognises the importance of well-being and mental health and other support for ministers and their households. Although some of that has really been couched in language of kind of supporting one's own well-being, whereas, as I think will become clear as we unpack our findings, actually the structural dimensions are really important for that lived experience of well-being too. And that's something that Selina Stone's report also flags. And there has been alongside this as well, and producing a sort of fertile soil for an exploration of working class clergy well-being, is an increased recognition of the bullying of clergy by I suppose parishioners. That's something that's received more attention in recent years, although I mean going back 10-15 years ago it started to emerge on the radar in various forums and discourses. So all of these things really have gone into the melting pot to kind of, like I say, provide that fertile soil of recognition that class is something that needs to be explored in relation to well-being and in relation to clergy well-being in particular. Sharon, is there anything you want to add to that backdrop?
No, that's a really good context that will just allow people to take that helicopter view of clergy well-being. And just to say as well that Alex and I are both involved in an evaluation project. Some of you may have heard of the St Luke's for Clergy pastoral supervision project. So a lot of the evaluation that we're doing with that, a lot of that will dovetail with the sort of themes that we're talking about today and wider in terms of those things that affect clergy once they're in post, that may or may not have been anticipated when they're in training and looking at the sort of theological training that they're doing. So we're hoping to revisit some of these ideas and practical policy making things in the context of what support well-being, what support for clergy well-being is in place and could be in place in terms of specifically in terms of pastoral supervision. So we're starting now with our various research projects to get a kind of rounder vision of what that means for clergy over and above working classness, which is where we started. Is that okay? So one thing that certainly when we started the project with Living Ministry, one thing that kind of exercised us a little, and we picked up from social media the kind of chatter that was going on is the definitions of working classness and whether you can call yourself working class if you are a clergy person or an academic. So we had those kind of conversations, and methodologically we had to justify how we were approaching people who we were seeking to speak to. In the end, we spoke to 50 clergy people, and we went for a self-identifying what's the word? A self-identifying cohort, so that we weren't imposing our definitions of working classness onto people who saw themselves as working class. And this is incredibly important, and we do emphasize it certainly in the original report. So officially, the Office for National Statistics it used to be the Registrar General, but there's always been this idea of hierarchical occupations that are categorised in certain ways. And this is a standard way of categorising people for research purposes. When we looked at this, we realised that clergy and academics are in the same occupational class, which is very close to the top, and that means that nothing of working classness can kind of penetrate that categorization, and it also sets up this barrier when you have a working class background and you're entering into an occupation that is socially constructed and recognized as being in a what we might see as a higher category of occupations. That throws up all sorts of cultural issues for people, and some of the parallels with academia are really striking, actually, when we've heard people's stories, clergy stories about class, and ordinance stories about class and their engagement with the process of being trained, strike real chords with me particularly. I identify as working class person in academia, and some of those institutional barriers are very, very similar. So that was very striking. We decided quite early on then that defining working class is absolutely about a person's background. There are just at the bottom there the sociological concept of habitus, which is Pierre Bourdieu is a sociologist who has popularized this idea of class being a culture, a part of an acculturation that people go through, depending on where they're born, their families, their schooling, access to resources, and what have you. So those backgrounds of people are key in being able to for people to be able to talk in the language of social class, without feeling that they needed to justify it because they were in a high category of occupation. And of course, with in terms of finance, clergy obviously not paid a great deal, and some aren't paid at all, of course. So in terms of measuring people's class in terms of earning capacity, that clearly doesn't quite fit how people might feel about themselves as social classed people. So we went down the self-identifying route. We asked people to describe their allegiance with class, why they thought they were working class, and then we collated this this idea of what working classness meant to our cohort. Now, there are risks with that, because we certainly did have people who would ordinarily fall outside of what we might have thought were working class folk. So people with grandparents who were working class. I'm really tempted to do a Keir Starmer and talk about parents being tool makers. And this idea of latching on to backgrounds that actually didn't really reflect a person's life trajectory. So we understood that the risks of having some people in the cohort that were like that, and that we took that into account when we looked at people's stories. But basically, people were telling us about their education. So if they were left school at 16 and went straight into the labour market, for example, that was one way of identifying themselves as working class. Although by no means did that exclude people from working class families who did go into higher education and university. That's still a common experience. Parental occupations were important as part of that understanding of the background, the habitus that we called it. So, parents being in manual jobs, perhaps only one parent working, and what that meant economically for the family. So if there was a sense of there not being enough access to enough resources. Housing tenure was another important indicator. So, and this becomes very important later on in the career of or the vocation of clergy people. Housing tenure, if you have not ever owned your own house, that actually comes out later on in terms of, well, how am I saving up for a retirement? Will the church look after me? So that was a really strong theme that came out of the original research. And then occupation before priesthood, so people feeling that their occupation did help them categorize themselves as working class if they were in a particular occupation. And I've just popped on the slide there that those are the categories of occupations that the ONS use. So if you are semi-routine occupations, a bus driver, something like that, or a skilled manual worker, those types of occupations are not the same as going into priesthood, and therefore when you go into higher education, some of the stories then started to unfold about how different those ideas of class were. This might, I forgot to say at the beginning, we are hoping there'll be questions and discussion, so we'll leave plenty of time for that. So this type of messiness, if you like, around social class and how people identify might come up in discussion. It is actually part of the fundamental ways of seeing barriers and therefore tackling barriers when you're talking about being in a classroom or institutional situation. So just to recap on the main messages from the original report we did, it was outside of our purview to go into a lot of detail about TEIs and that training part of clergy people's trajectory. But there was too much in people's stories to completely ignore. So we did recognise that we needed to touch on it in the main report. But since then, we made the commitment to flesh that out and to honour those stories and make much more of them, and which is why we're here today. And Becky did an excellent job of just pulling out those stories into the briefing note that hopefully you've all had a chance to have a look at. So that in the main report, we tried to be very practical. That TEIs were flexible and person-centered in terms of the approach that they take, and we completely acknowledge that absolutely happens. This is a reflection of some of the stories only, but part of that was institutionally understanding and valuing experiences and learning styles that come out of different backgrounds. So if somebody hasn't attended a higher educational institution before, there are certain areas that might need support, and we'll go into more detail in a little while. And we just need to absolutely emphasize, we saw this as widening when we're talking about not having this narrow approach to higher education, academic achievement. We're talking about a widening the gate, widening participation, rather than lowering the bar. So not at any point did anybody suggest to us, and nor would we suggest, that working class people are not able to absorb or catch up or operate in an intensely academic environment. That was not the message at all. Simply that there are advantages if you have been acculturated already into a certain type of academic environment. So there's some catching up to do, or there were different approaches, different ways of accessing the same information at the same level that might not be part of the traditional academic route. So we just needed to really emphasize.
Oh, Sharon, you're muted. Sorry.
Did that just happen accidentally, automatically? I think I leant on my button. Sorry about that. Thank you. So really just to emphasize that it was widening access to the milieu of academic life and not lowering the standards of that. That was not the message at all. And the second recommendation was that TEIs allow a kind of flexibility if it wasn't possible to have full-time access to that. Often people needed to work at the same time, so this access to resources was a big theme. I'm just going to really very quickly, because I'm aware of time, I'm going to whiz through the bands of stories and the themes that we then fleshed out for the briefing note. So you're talking about culture and belonging. So some of these barriers that people described to us were about what you wear, what you eat and drink, what interests you have, what your tastes are in social situations. Are you a pub drinker or a wine bar drinker? These things became quite important in terms of social interaction. And accent was another really important marker. It was so regional accents, northern accents particularly, being read as working class. And sort of several people talked to us about how when they were training that their accent became a focal point, to the extent that some people believed that they were asked to not emphasize their regional accent. And then there's the material theme. So one person said a really brilliant thing about being working class is having a restricted access to resources. So this has these material impacts. And one major thing was about accommodation, this assumption that accommodation was not going to be a problem. And one person said, actually, if I couldn't carry on staying in the university, the college digs, then I was effectively homeless because I had nowhere else to go. So it's those kind of material impacts. Social mobility was talked about a lot, and this idea about what is valued in terms of background and experience. And this idea that we have of social mobility being always upwards, rather than it being sharing and stretching and growing horizontally. So people enjoyed expanding their tastes and their experiences, but it's problematic if we see that as social mobility moving upwards. It tends to denigrate people's working class backgrounds. And then more importantly for this gathering the classroom experiences, so the language that's used that we're all familiar with if we've been through higher education was actually a barrier. So one person said they didn't even know what undergrad and postgrad meant and where they were supposed to go. So it's that understanding that not everybody is acculturated to the academic milieu, if you like. There were stories about discourses that happened in the classroom, for example, around the poor and this idea of Indigenous leadership when you're talking about estate's mission. So there's a whole conversation to be had about how that is talked about. And there's a kind of lack of open discussion. It was felt there was a lack of open discussion about social class, even in themes of diversity. Social class seems to be this sort of less talked about thing, as Alex said right at the beginning. And academic assumptions, I think I've laboured the point that just because somebody hasn't already experienced higher education doesn't mean that they won't flourish in a very rarefied academic environment. One or two folks told us they loved being exposed to that for the first time in their lives and have since gone on to be very academically motivated. So it's understanding that those are the barriers that are felt as well as the cultural ones. And just very finally, asking for help and added resources was difficult for people. So if they didn't know how Word worked, which seems like second nature to lots of people, it feels very vulnerable to ask for that additional help. So in a classroom situation, the messages are about making that normal and easy and not exceptional, so that people weren't feeling that they were getting something special because they're not quite part of the culture. Please do read the briefing note. Those are fleshed out in some detail with lots of quotes and stories to kind of exemplify some of those points. And no doubt some of that will have fed through into the practical policy making side of things that people like Rachel will have been doing. Let me just move that on. So Alex.
Great, thank you, Sharon. Yes, so this is really another bit of context setting to help explain how we've got to where we are with policies like the action plan that Rachel's going to be talking you through from her own context, and which I know you've had to engage with across the TEIs. So this is really just a sort of narrative, again, to help set the scene. And essentially, when we were asked to undertake this research for the National Ministry team, it was very clear that the Church of England wanted policy recommendations that were rooted in the research that we were doing, which was, to us, very good news indeed. And so we started with the data. We started with the lived experience of our interlocutors, the people that we interviewed initially. What did they report experiencing in their lives as clergy people from working class backgrounds, however they defined that, as Sharon said. And so that really was a methodological question for us to start with. It was important that we did something called semi-structured interviews. They're designed to enable your interlocutors, the people that you speak to steer the conversations in ways that they deem most relevant. and it allows you to see how they interpret the questions that you're asking them as well. So you get that in-depth answer that provides you with the granular details of lived experience, whereas a quantitative approach, being statistically heavy, might not give you that fine-grained information about what it's like to live as a working class person, or as a working class priest or deacon in the Church of England. Actually, semi-structured interviews do that, whilst also facilitating or giving your participants the ability to drive the conversation in various ways. And then how we analysed that, we took an approach called descriptive coding to begin with. So we needed to generate themes, right? What were the most important and talked about points across the different interviews that we did, and we did 50 interviews in total, which I think was about double what we were expecting to do, but there were many people who wanted to talk to us about this, which was great. It expanded the project significantly, and therefore the information we had was all the richer. But when we were creating the themes to decide how much to decide what the most important points were, we decided to start with language that was used by the people that we spoke to, right? Just as a way of foregrounding that lived experience. But then after we'd done that, we'd switched to something called pattern coding, which was really finding what was the most common experiences across the 50 people we spoke to, whilst also recognizing in the report the things that were less common as well. And then finally, focused coding really enabled us to then highlight what the most important themes that emerged from the interviews were, for helping us specifically understand the lived experience of well-being from working class clergy. And the reason I go into that detail is because the way that we set out the project, the way that we gathered data and analysed data, was really designed to foreground the lived experience, to amplify the voices of the clergy that this piece of research is ultimately designed to serve. And I think that's got to be the basis of any research that is going to lead to policy recommendations, for obvious reasons. But then we spoke with half of our initial participants, so 25 of those we interviewed came to focus groups, and that was an opportunity for us to test our themes with them, as well as to test our policy recommendations. It was basically a chance for us to reflect back to them. Here's what we think we're hearing. Here's what we think is going to help if the Church of England were to do these things. Going back to what I said previously, it's not simply about self-help, because we recognise that clergy are expressing agency all the time in whatever ways they can, but there are structural factors that are shaping well-being in the Church of England. And so we fine-tuned, we honed our policy recommendations as well as our themes in light of those focus groups. And I think we conducted 4 focus groups with 25 people. So most of them had, I think, 6 people in, one had 7 people. So that really led to the draft recommendations that we submitted in the initial report to the Church of England. The way that these projects have worked with Living Ministry is there's been an advisory group that has consisted of people with lived experience of, in our case, working class identity. For a different project I've recently completed with my colleague at Bournemouth, Sally Lee, on the well-being of disabled and neurodivergent clergy, we had again an advisory team and an advisory board of clergy with lived experience of either being disabled or being neurodivergent. So that was something that was built into the project and provided very helpfully by the national ministry team. And so that was a further iteration of exploring with those with lived experience of what sorts of policies might be helpful, and so just a further fine-tuning as well before the final report was published. And then we found that there were natural champions of this report who we were delighted and able to work with. And when I say natural champions, I don't necessarily mean people who were working class. There was a mixture of people who were and who weren't. But one of the things that I think really helped was Sharon Doherty's championing the report very energetically at the General Synod. I think that was 2020. Was that 24? Was that the start of 25, Sharon? It might have been the February 25, but I think it was in 2024.
Yeah, I think you're right, because it's been since again to synod. So
yes, yeah, just recently.
Yeah.
And then of course there's Bishop Lynn Cullins as well, who has lived experience as a working class person as well, and she's been heading up various task groups as well. And so finding the natural champions has been a really important part of ensuring that there's policy progression, because Sharon and I's agency in ensuring this is having some sort of impact becomes reduced once the report is published. We do what we can in order to try and push for those policy recommendations, but ultimately we're relying on collaboration with other people within the Church of England, within the ordained structures, within the General Synod, for example, in order to help ensure that that the findings are understood, they see the light of day, and that the recommendations are acted upon. So those natural champions were a really integral part of that process. And of course, they did go to General Synod, and that was bolstered by a separate discourse, really, that gathered momentum and intersected with the discourse of the report. I'm thinking of the work that Father Alex Frost was doing around the same time. And he released, I forget the title of the book, but it was around the same time, or perhaps shortly after his book came out as well, highlighting some of his experiences plus his podcast as well. And as a member of the General Synod, was able to kind of present a different strand of discourse around class as well. And these things kind of merged and went into this wider melting pot, really, that gathered momentum for amplifying working class experiences of priesthood or being in the diaconate, which was incredibly helpful. But as Sharon has just indicated, this has really been part of an iterative process, because the Church of England is synodically governed. Of course, things don't happen particularly quickly. And so it means that, work is done, motions are produced, the synod votes, as you'll all know, and then that leads to more work which gets done in between the synods, and then additional motions are proposed in light of work that's fed back and so on. And so we're still in that place of iterative development. Most recently, and this must have been the February Synod of 2026, that's just happened, there was a reporting back on some of the progress. So, for example, the Church of England is investing, I think, £150,000 into sort of work going to support the development of vocations amongst working class people. So there's still a lot of things in the pipeline, and there's a lot of things to happen, but this has been the process really that has ultimately led to the implementation of those policy recommendations. But it's been one thread around class that's been happening simultaneously. And so these things, I think, are bouncing off each other. I think they're bolstering each other and feeding into this richer, wider discourse as well, which is leading to different policy changes, to different processes and task groups that are being developed in order to address the issues that have been highlighted by our report, but also by via other channels as well. So that's really where we're up to on the policy front, and that's how we got there. But like I say, there's still a fair amount of work to do, and Sharon and I really are trying to, and very open to collaborating with people within and across the Church of England in order to ensure that this work progresses in a way that is ultimately helpful for the people this work is intended to serve.
And
is there anything?
Yeah, just off the back of that, Rachel's going to any second now is going to bring it right back down to theological education for ordinands, and so that process of weaving this sort of stuff into practical policy it is a very interesting process for us to witness. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what Rachel's got to take us through, and just again to just keep thinking about questions and things you want to challenge or ideas that you want to throw into the pot, and we'll give hopefully 25 minutes to questions after Rachel's taken us through her process of putting some of these ideas into some sort of actionable state. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you. If you go on to the next one, sorry, I so I'm now completely flummoxed myself. I've put together a little timeline here of, and I've turned my camera off, haven't I? That's rude. I've put together a timeline here of everything that, from my point of view, has fed into the work I've been doing at ERMC, and that's been going on at every TEI. So in May 23, the report was published, and then in March 25, TEIs were invited to send a couple of staff to the first TEI Class and Classism Conference Day, and I was able to go with someone else from ERMC. And then in October 25, wider consultation groups were begun that fed into the General Synod debate. And then in autumn 25, all TEIs had to submit a class or classism action plan, which everybody did. And then in March 26, we were invited to a second TEI Class and Classism conference. And I know I've met some of you there. And now we've reached the point where the review of the action plan is through the annual self-evaluation process. So there's no more formal request to put in new action plans, just a review through the evaluation process. If we go on to the next slide, this is a quote, but just to explain a bit more why I got involved in the plan was because when I read the first report, the Let Justice Roll Down Like Waters report, it had a huge impact on me. I read it cover to cover, walked into our principal's office because it happened to come out on a day I was in the office, and said, everybody needs to read this and we need to do something. I found it, and it still is, a difficult read for me. Because it made me angry at how some people are treated. It helped me identify some of my own experiences. It left me frustrated that it's taken this long to get this far. And it also made me feel guilty for not having spoken out when I'd encountered issues. Because sometimes you think, is it really just me, or is it a real issue? Is it really that important? This quote is of my own experience, that it wasn't intentional, but during training we used to, at residential weekends, have newspapers brought in, and there was a discussion one summer about which newspapers should come in. And although the choice between newspapers was politically divided, there were some off-head comments. It was also a broadsheet tabloid issue, but at its heart for me, it was a class issue. And in the one sentence, my family was dismissed for their reading of newspapers. The reality is that which newspaper you read really isn't important in the grand scheme of things, but how we talk about it and their readers is important. It hurts, and it felt as though my family and I were put into a category of being almost unclean because of the paper we moved and read and not discerning enough. So that was why I wanted to get involved when this opportunity came up, because it made me think on my own experience and want to improve things for people coming through in the future. At ERMC, we're now on our second version of the action plan. I got the first one written with help from others, but then when we were given access, those of us who went to the last conference were each given an anonymised version of the action points from everybody's action plans. And I realised how much they were very similar. But it also made me look at our action plan and think that I wanted to know our current students' voices were in there. And I met with Sharon and Alex, and they encouraged me in that. So I met at a residential weekend with any student one-to-one who felt they self-identified as working class. For some of them, it was they felt working class because of their upbringing. They felt their life had moved on, but still felt very rooted in that. Others who had a working class background, but now felt they were no longer working class. And others who were still very much involved in a working class environment through their work, through their home life, through their family life. So it gave us a mix. We've now, I've expanded the sections in our action plan, so we now have sections on culture, language and symbols of elitism. I like that phrase. Work and life outside of training, flexibility of training, access course, access to study skills support, financial issues and placements. And each section has some general information, quotes from students, and the resulting action points. So what I thought I'd do now is share with you 4 of those quotes, and then talk a bit about the background and the action points that are coming from that. So this one is, I shed tears over an assignment, reflecting on the doctrine demonstrated in an artwork. It was totally outside my life experience. I don't spend time in art galleries. It was a gift and a privilege to be asked to reflect theologically on art, but I didn't know where to start. This raised the issue of the assumptions that all our students would have the same cultural capital when they don't. And this surprised me because we have a large contingent of students from the diocese in Europe. So we're aware that not everyone comes with the same information, the same background, the same knowledge and understanding of things. So when we have an ERMC pantomime, we have to spend time explaining how it works. The casting, the general silliness and the audience participation for everyone to be able to appreciate it. However, on this occasion, in an assignment description, we slipped. We gave students a list of artworks, but said that they could choose something else if they wanted. But that assumed that people would have that information in their background to be able to select something, or the necessary skills to be able to talk about art in the way we were asking them to. It was a result of seeking to diversify the type of assignment and how we approached it, moving away from standard essays. And the student themselves, with me, identified a session that came up in a later biblical studies module that would have been really helpful to have had before they did this assignment. So now we're looking at ways to reinterpret that session, to give it a doctrinal emphasis so that it's there first, and also to expand our list of suggested artworks to give more variety, some more modern artwork, perhaps something less highbrow, maybe even cartoons, but something that allows people to engage in a broader way. And with that, as well as solving this issue, there's now this awareness that when we set an assignment, we need to work out what are the skills and knowledge that we're assuming someone has to be able to answer this, to make sure we can meet any gaps that there are. If we go on to our next slide, this is my voice when I finished training, and during it I was painfully aware I'm unskilled at networking. Put me in a room of hierarchy and I don't know what to do. And I really don't know what to do. I'm a little contrary. I will happily fling myself around a dance floor, at a line dance or a barn dance, but can't move at a disco. I'm naturally shy and avoid people, but I'm perfectly happy standing in front of the congregation or in front of my students. What you might notice from that is the formal and organised is okay. Free and relaxed and informal is really difficult. It's why I find networking difficult. It's informal, there are rules, but I've no idea what they are. But equally, I don't want to become a networker. I want equality of access to opportunities. Our response as a TEI has been to look for ways that we can introduce opportunities for students to mingle with the church hierarchy in environments where there isn't an underlying pressure. Because the trouble is, as an ordinand, most of the time when you meet a bishop, it's formal. But to find some way of doing that in an informal way, to develop confidence in those types of situations. But alongside that, I also think we need to find ways to equip our students to raise questions when the church relies on networking to fill roles, even though most of those roles they fill are voluntary. I still feel that there is more work to be done. And if we go on to number 3, this student was hit by the impact of part-time training on employment. The number of times they had to step out of work during working hours or use annual leave to complete work for training. Noting it would be helpful if, whenever possible, that's taken into account and maybe a longer period is allowed to complete placements or activities. But also grateful that residential training at ERMC is all weekends apart from summer school. We are very realistic at ERMC about how much time training takes, about the average weekly commitment. But this quote raised the question for me about whether we are clear enough about the potential impact on your work life, about how frequently students give up annual leave to attend training events, whether that's residential weekends or evening classes or placements. It's a lot. I know I sacrificed half of my annual leave in my 2nd and 3rd year of training in order to get to attend residentials and to catch up on everything I missed at home while I was away, before even thinking about time to write assignments. We included in our action plan the need to advocate for better financial provision, particularly for those training part-time. Recent changes, and I know there are some meetings about to go ahead over the next couple of weeks for students who are full-time, about the changes to the maintenance grant system. They seem quite impressive. For part-time ordinands, it's an extra £600 a year, which is a significant increase on the current book allowance, to enable at least some provision of IT equipment. However, we noted it hadn't solved all the financial issues, particularly those around childcare costs or financial loss. TEI level, we constantly need to monitor the demands placed on students, particularly in the knowledge that residential weekends have an increased impact on those who have to give up work to attend. There's a sacrifice for some of annual leave, and for others, a sacrifice of actual income. We mitigate it as much as we can by being flexible over arrival times, flexible over leaving times. But we also need to ensure students are claiming all the financial support that they are eligible for. And that grant making information is easily accessible. I set up a Moodle page to hold all that information on finance for students, but we need to update. There isn't a magic central list because lots of dioceses have access to different funds. We have one in St Albans Diocese which provides grants to female clergy, lay readers and ordinands, but not lay readers in training. But it is very specific to a specific group of our students. But the next step will be to contact all our dioceses to find out what is available there and add that into that list. It was very much about making sure students have the information they need to be able to access what they're entitled to and what they may need. And then our final quote was this one: placements are always difficult. The social context placement more so, because so much of it requires being available weekdays. We need to use annual leave to complete them, resulting in less rest time and greater stress. In a way, it's similar to the previous comment on finance. Most of our part-time students will complete a placement in both a different church from their normal context and a social context placement. The church placement is easier because it can be spread over a number of Sundays and perhaps just one evening session outside of work. The social context placement is more difficult because it's often tied to the working pattern of the placement supervisor or the opening hours of the project, and often requires taking time off work. How we've addressed that is we'd already extended the time period over which a placement can take place, so that this year we're telling students that they can take it at any point between the end of our summer term and January, the end of January. So they get a clear 7 months in which to complete their placement, giving greater flexibility. But we're also a list of those placements that operate at weekends and evenings, so that students are aware of what might be the easiest fit in their circumstance. I'm just going to conclude by saying that at ERMC, the student voice was essential to producing our action plan, and they'll be essential to its success in helping to achieve the actions and in identifying new areas that need to be addressed or new responses. For those of you here as students and TEI staff, from my perspective, our action plan will be going on Moodle so that our students can see it, and to encourage them to help us achieve the plan by offering to help us where and if they can, to hold us accountable so that it doesn't slip from the agenda. Life for TEI staff is incredibly demanding, so it's easy for things to slip from the top of the list when there are 40 other equally urgent and important things that need to be done. And it will be a living document that stays with us. So that the encouragement to our students and staff is, when you see something that you don't think is right, tell us, so that we can think about it and add it into our plan and think, is there more that we can be doing? I'm going to hand back to Sharon.
Rachel, thank you so much. That was honestly just brilliant. We couldn't have planned it any better. We have planned it, obviously, but that was it. Just completely put flesh on the bones of what we're doing. Just hold your horses with the feedback link. Feel free to do that after the question and answer or discussion session that Mike's going to chair and lead for us, because I haven't set the correct permissions. So I'll reload that link into the chat. So I'll stop sharing actually and hand over to Mike.
Thanks for that. Thanks so much, Sharon, Alex, and Rachel.